Well, good morning, everybody. It's a delightful thing to see Presbyterians give a Saturday to learning. I'm deeply impressed by that. We are all aware, and I'm sure you're a part of that awareness, of how rapidly and dramatically the church is changing these days. No one in this room, me included, knows what the church is going to look like in 50 years. But one thing we do know, it will not look like it does today. One thing is clear to me: God is tearing down what we have in order to build up something new and hopefully more faithful. Now, honestly, I have personally some grief and pain about the tearing down of the structures that I have given my life to. I've given my life to the Presbyterian Church. I drive by at least twice a week a church in Atlanta called the In-Town Community Church. The In-Town Community Church. Now, you would have to go deep into the DNA of that church to discover that it is a Presbyterian church. It's a PCA church, but it's Presbyterian. And the reason you'd have to go deep into their DNA is they don't want you to know that it's a Presbyterian church. They think that's bad branding, that to claim a denominational identity in this culture actually is a turnoff to our current generation, and so they hide their denominational identity with a neutral name. In the 70s, a liturgical scholar by the name of James White surveyed the map of worship styles in America, and he found 4 of them: the Catholic Mass, high liturgical, low to moderate Protestant, and free church. Those were the 4 styles in the 1970s that James White found. And what box you were in was a product of your history and heritage. The Catholics were in the Catholic Mass. Most Episcopalians and some Lutherans were in the high liturgical. Presbyterians and Methodists were in the low to middle Protestant. Baptists and Pentecostals were in the free church. Well, right at the turn of the 21st century, another liturgical scholar by the name of Robert Weber re-looked at the map. He also found 4 prevalent styles out there. He called them liturgical, traditional Protestant, creative contemporary, and praise and charismatic. Now, what's interesting were the example congregations that he named that fell in each of those 4 boxes. Guess which church he named for traditional Protestant? The Overland Park, Kansas Church of the Nazarene. Now, how in the world did the Overland Park, Kansas Church of the Nazarene skitter from free church to traditional Protestant in the matter of 25 years? What happened in those 25 years is that we all severed the ligaments with our history and heritage, so that our worship style is no longer a product of our history, it's a product of our marketing choice. We pick the particular boutique that we wish to represent in the marketplace of worship opportunities. Now, I get that. It's one of the ways that the church is changing, but I have some grief about the loss of our heritage and identity. I love the Presbyterian Church and the Reformed tradition. I'd like to see it extended. But it's one of the things that's up for grabs: traditional denominational identity. Will it exist in 50 years? I've given most of my ministry to theological education, seminary life. We're being told by the most knowledgeable authorities that the Master of Divinity degree, which is the bread and butter of most seminaries, it's the degree that educates most pastors in churches, is on its way to obsolescence. That it'll probably end up like an MBA, something nice to have, but not necessary. A lot of reasons for that. One of them is, as the church gets smaller and smaller, congregations are simply not able to afford a fully educated and trained and pensioned pastor. And so other models are emerging, like a tent-making ministry or a local pastor, and the educational process is different. These people usually can't afford to go to seminary for 3 years to get a Master of Divinity, and so they're being educated in different ways. Or on the other end of the spectrum, the larger churches will often have a staff of niche specialists, like there'll be the youth minister or the community action minister, and sometimes those are not educated across the spectrum, but only in their narrow niche. Several years ago, I was in a huge Methodist church in Texas, and at one point after the program, the pastor took me on a tour of the building, and when we went into the suite of offices for the ministers, there was one corridor, and I counted it, 16 offices, 16 staff members, all in media. Now, that's a lot of media ministers. And almost none of them were theologically trained. They were trained in media. Now, the church is up for grabs. And I want to know how we're going to make decisions in the face of this kind of uncertainty. And this morning, I would like to suggest that while some things will endure, I think there will always be people preaching the gospel. I think there'll always be prayerful people gathered around the font or the pool or the river and around the communion table. And there will always be disciples being the light and salt in the world. That the form of those is up for grabs, and the only way to make decisions is to try to look at each decision through the eyes and mind of Jesus Christ. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to get at the eyes and mind of Jesus Christ through his parables. John Dominic Crossan, a famous New Testament scholar, said, Jesus was not crucified because he spoke in parables. He was crucified because he believed parables, because he saw the world parabolically, because he lived out his life out of the parables. And so when we get into the parabolic mindset, what we are really getting into is the faith and religious imagination of Jesus, and it allows us to approach the changes of the church by asking a different kind of question. What would Jesus imagine? You know, our teenagers some years back were wearing bracelets, what would Jesus do? And that's a good question. But frankly, there's sometimes we don't know what Jesus would do exactly. Would he have a cell phone? I don't know. Would he drive a Prius? Would he have a frequent flyer number with Delta? I don't know what Jesus would do in every situation, and therefore I can't make my decisions on the basis of imitating behavior that I can't predict. But what we are given is the opportunity to look at decisions that we make through the imagination of Jesus. It puts responsibility on us because we're the ones who have to make the decisions, but it allows us to move forward in a way that is faithful, even though it's risky and unpredictable. There is a computer program, you may have heard of it, called Second Life. If you were to log on your computer onto Second Life, what you would have there is a alternate universe. The way that you enter this alternate universe is you create an avatar of yourself. Now, the free avatar is not very interesting, but if you want to customize your avatar, you can become the fantasy person that you wish you were. You can become beautiful or handsome or buff or athletic or whatever you want. It costs money, you have to put it on your credit card, but you can create an avatar of yourself and you enter into this alternate universe. And once you're in there, you can buy property, you can start a business. It's another world. Some of the students at the school where I taught, the theological school, chipped in some money and they bought some land and built a church in Second Life. And avatars preach and lead in worship, and other avatars come to worship. And they began logging in the middle of the week, and they would go into their church in the middle of the week, and they would find avatars kneeling at the altar rail. They would try to strike up conversation, and sometimes the avatars would talk back, and sometimes they wouldn't. But there was one particular avatar who was eager to talk, and she began to share that she had had some terrible experiences in the real church, and that this digital church was the only safe space she had spiritually. The conversations deepened and deepened and deepened, and then the avatar asked to be baptized. That set up a terrible debate on campus. Is there such a thing as digital baptism? If you wanted to know my position, I said that we ought to invite this woman to the Chattahoochee River on Sunday afternoon and to do this for real. And if she said, I don't want to be public, say that baptism is public. And if she said, I don't want to take that kind of risk, to say baptism is a risk. But others made a cogent case that in this world, the digital life is an authentic extension of self, and that we can possibly consider a digital sacramental life. The debate raged. We finally decided we didn't have enough information to change things, and unfortunately the conversations drifted away. But these are the sort of decisions we will be making, and we need to be able to come at them nimbly and with imagination. So if we look at things through the lens of Jesus' parables, what sort of imagination would we have? Well, I want to suggest several characteristics that are found in the parables that would shape a faithful imagination as we go forward in these uncertain waters in the church. The first characteristic was suggested to me by a French philosopher and biblical scholar who was always fascinated with the parables. His name was Paul Ricoeur, and I wish I could speak this with an authentic French accent because it sounds so much better in the French. But what he said was, the parables are marked by extravagance. That in almost every parable, there is something that spills over the top with excess and abundance. For example, the Gospel of Mark presents that the first parable that Jesus ever told in his ministry was the parable about the sower who went out to sow, and he sowed some seed, and it fell on various kinds of soil. Some of it fell on the hard path, and before it could sprout, the birds came and plucked it away. And other of the seed fell on rocks, and before it could wind its way down into the spare soil, the sun came out and scorched it. And others fell on thorns, and they grew up and choked it. But some of it fell on good soil, and it produced 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold extravagance. By the way, Matthew is more modest. He reverses the numbers. 100-fold, well, maybe 60-fold, probably 30-fold. But Mark has it in a crescendo, 30, 60, 100. Now, sometimes you will read stupid comments in commentaries that sound like this. This parable reflects ancient agricultural methods in Palestine. Baloney! No farmer in his right mind in the history of the world has ever farmed this way. Thorns? Woo! Rocks? Sure. Hard ground? Why not? Paul Tillich, in a sermon on this parable, put it this way. The history of the people of God is a history of people who have not been afraid to waste themselves. They waste themselves and their love like God wastes his. I was talking to the leaders of a fairly conservative Presbyterian church. They said they had a very interesting session meeting recently. There is a proposal before the church to spend $10 million to renovate the sanctuary. And at the session meeting, one of the elders said, I have no objections to making the sanctuary beautiful. If we want a new organ, pews and cushions in the pews, I'm not against it. But I think if we're going to spend $10 million on the sanctuary, we ought to also spend $10 million on a facility for the homeless in our town. And one of the other elders said, you must be kidding. I mean, I'm in favor of a homeless ministry, but $10 million on the homeless? And he said, well, you remember that story in the New Testament about that woman who broke that jar of costly perfume and spread it on Jesus' feet? Wouldn't it be beautiful if we could do something like that? Lavish, extravagant, abundant. One of my friends in ministry is Scott Black Johnston. He's the pastor of the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City. And he became the pastor of the Fifth Avenue Church in August of 2008. August 2008. In October of 2008, the world came apart economically. He told me, you think people in Atlanta were frightened, you should have been in New York City. I have Wall Street people in my congregation, and they were climbing the walls. What is more, our church is mortgaged up to its neck, and pledges were beginning to fall away, and we were in panic mode. And I had one panic-struck meeting of the finance committee after another, and they always ended the same way. We would get to the end of the meeting, and the chair would say, okay, I think we've got it, as long as another shoe doesn't drop. And of course, within a few days, another shoe would drop. We'd have to have another finance committee meeting, and it would end, well, okay, I think we've cut to the bone now. We're okay as long as another shoe doesn't drop. He said, I was doing all right with this, said Scott. I was being a good pastor, I thought. I was trying to calm them down and keep them faithful. But he said one shoe kept dropping after another, and one afternoon, all by myself in my office, I lost it. I got really frightened. I said, I'm going to fail. This church is going to fail. We are not going to make it. This is a ministry that is going down the tubes. And he said, my head dropped to the desk, and I spontaneously prayed to God. He said, I prayed, God, please, no more shoes. I had no sooner prayed that prayer than there was a knock at the door. It was the sexton. Dr. Johnston, I think you better come down to the overnight shelter right away. He said, I got up, I have a little homeless shelter in the church, and I went down there thinking, what fresh hell is this? And sure enough, when I got down there, there were two uniformed New York City police officers waiting on me. And one of them said, Pastor, we have just raided an illegal factory in Brooklyn making counterfeit Timberland boots. We've seized the stock. We thought the homeless could use them. We've got 700 pairs of shoes here. Scott said, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Because in my panic and fear, I had run into the extravagance of God. To shape our imagination out of the abundance of grace and mercy and kindness. When I was writing a little book several years ago on worship, I interviewed a pastor also in New York City who said that he was called to this church, and the first Sunday he was there, he knew that he had been lied to by the pulpit committee. He said, I thought they had called me to save this church and to build it back up, but I looked out at a dispirited congregation, and I knew that I had been called to bury it. And after the service, I went across the street to Starbucks, and I ordered a latte, and I sat in the window of Starbucks, and I looked out at this mausoleum of a church I had been called to, and I was cursing God for putting me in this predicament. And he said, all of a sudden, and Tom, I am not this kind of person, but all of a sudden, I had a religious vision. I saw every door of that building wide open and people streaming from east and west and north and south to be in this church. And he said, out of that, I learned the most important word of my ministry. Yes. You play the saxophone? Yeah, but I'm not really into, yes, we can use you. You're an English major at NYU? Yeah, but I'm not into church. We can use you to read the scripture. Yes, yeah. I began to say yes to people. If you go to that church today on Sunday morning, every door is wide open, and people are streaming from east and west and north and south because of the imagination of extravagance, the exuberance of yes. Doesn't have to be a big church. My wife and I have a place on the Chesapeake Bay in rural Maryland. There are no Presbyterian churches in our county, none. There's a Methodist church every 50 feet. And so we go to the nearest one. It's called Antioch Methodist Church. There are about 20 of us on a good Sunday. They're down so small, they only have one mission left, only one. They're building. And they leave it open 24/7 for anybody in the community who wants to come in and pray. Well, one summer we got there and the congregation was in a snit because the insurance company had found out about this 24/7 open policy and had told them, no, you can't do that, you need to lock the church. At the congregational meeting to discuss this, one woman stood up and said, I think we ought to get another insurance company. The president of the congregation said, they're all the same. Now that the secret's out, they're all going to make us lock the church. Then another person said, well, let's don't have insurance. The president said, no, the building might burn down. Well, they talked about it, and finally they decided that they had to knuckle under and lock Antioch Methodist Church. So they put a padlock on the door. And they took the key and put it under a rock with the word key painted on it next to... I don't know what the church is going to look like, but I do recognize disciples who see the world and the faith with eyes of extravagance and extraordinary grace. Second characteristic of the parables that I want to talk about is reversal. In so many of the parables of Jesus, there is this sudden moment of reversal in which that which was not important becomes ultimate, and that which was thought to be so important becomes negligible. What is the most important thing that you own? Is it the Van Gogh that you have hanging in your living room? I know you do have one. Or is it the rubber life raft you have in the garage? It depends on whether the dam has broken. When the dam breaks, the Van Gogh can go, and the rubber life raft becomes everything. That's the way it is with the parables. There is this sudden reversal of fortune, and the things that were counted to be important are not. Serene Jones, who is the president of Union Seminary in New York, has a wonderful book called Feminist Theory and Christian Theology. And one of the great things about this theological book that she has written is that everything she claims in the book, she grounds in the experience of the real life church. And she's talking about, in one place, about churches that live out of this sense of reversal, that they are standing on the pivot of a shift in values, and they are lifting up that which the world considers insignificant. And she talks about the church that she went to in New Haven, Connecticut, that has a Christmas pageant every Christmas, but it's not just a pageant about the children. Everybody in the congregation is invited to have a part in the Christmas. In fact, people in the community are invited to have parts. And one particular Christmas, they invited a homeless man who sleeps in the doorway of the church to play the role of the innkeeper at Bethlehem. His name was Reggie. There was also a woman, Joyce, who participates in the life of the congregation, who is mentally challenged. And they asked her to be in the balcony with the women's choir and to sing the shepherd's song from the Gospel of Luke. At first, she didn't want to do it, but they said they would help her and support her. So the night of the pageant came. Mary and Joseph come trudging down the center aisle. There is Reggie in the doorway of the inn at Bethlehem. And Joseph says to Reggie, "We have traveled a long way. We are weary from our journey. We seek lodging." And Reggie said, "Sure, come on in." That wasn't the way it was supposed to go. And so Joseph backed up and said his line again. "We have traveled a long way, and we are weary from our journey, and we seek lodging." "I get it," said Reggie. "Come on in." It became clear, said Serene Jones, that as long as Reggie was running the hotel in Bethlehem, nobody was going to be homeless. And then the angels began to sing, "Peace on earth, goodwill to all," and you could hear Joyce's voice lifting up above the others. And then when the hymn had ended, Joyce continued to sing, and what she said was, "I had no idea I could be an angel." This great imagination of reversal, what the world counts as negligible, in the imagination of Jesus and the imagination of the church becomes important to us. When I was a boy, my grandmother lived in an antebellum home in South Carolina, beautiful home, and we had two rooms that Southerners will recognize. There was the parlor, and the parlor was the formal room, and that's where the dead were laid out and people were married and the preacher was entertained. But then there was the place where the family really lived, and that was called the settin' room. And in the settin' room, my grandmother had on the wall a gallery of portraits of people in our family. It was my mother and my father and my uncles and my aunts and my grandfather, and some of them were photographs and some of them were oil paintings, but the whole family was there, and right in the middle of it, there was the picture of a young man, a sepia photograph, a young man in the uniform of the Union Army at the time of the Civil War. It's a very odd thing to be on the wall of a settin' room in South Carolina. I asked my grandmother, "Who is that?" And she said, "When you are old enough, I will tell you." One summer, I was a teenager, and I was visiting her, and I was in the settin' room all by myself one afternoon, and the door opened, and she came in and sat down, and she said, "I want to tell you who that man is." I said, "Okay." She said, "His name is Joseph Twitchell, and he became the pastor of the Asylum Hill Congregational Church in Hartford, Connecticut, and he was Mark Twain's best friend. They traveled in Europe together, and Twain wrote about it in Innocents Abroad and other writings. But when he was a young man, he was a chaplain in the Army of the Potomac. And after the Battle of Williamsburg in Virginia, he was out on the battlefield riding on his horse, looking for soldiers who had been wounded and left behind in that terrible battle. And he found one. An 18-year-old Confederate boy lying bleeding to death in a ditch. He pulled him out of the ditch, took him to the Union medical tent, where the surgeons amputated his leg at the knee and cauterized his leg and saved his life. And then Twitchell raised enough money to send the boy home to his relieved parents in South Carolina. That 18-year-old Confederate soldier grew up to be a Presbyterian minister and a college president, and more important to me, my great-grandfather. Nobody had to teach us the parable of the Good Samaritan. I'm here today because of it. Because somebody with the imagination to know that that which was negligent, the wounded soldier of the enemy, was in the eyes of God somebody important and saved his life. We be the church that has the parabolic imagination of reversal. One other characteristic, and this one's maybe the hardest to take, there is something of disruption in every one of Jesus' parables. If we hear them only as gentle stories about sheep and shepherds and fathers and sons, we have misheard the parables because all of them have a jagged edge. There is something that they are doing disruptively. Consider this parable that Jesus told, and I am ashamed of the little stories and sermons that I have preached on this parable. The kingdom of heaven, he said, is like a woman who took yeast and mixed it in with 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. And what I have done with that parable is to say, oh, the kingdom, isn't it wonderful? It starts so small, but it grows and grows until it leavens the whole loaf. Oh, listen. Every single word in that parable is an offense. The kingdom of heaven, said Jesus, and you know what his listeners thought? The nationalistic, militaristic kingdom of David reestablished. No, it's like a woman. It's like a woman who took yeast. Now, we think of yeast as a little Fleischmann's packs that you get at Publix, but do you know that the word yeast is never a good word in the Bible? Yeast is a corrosive corrupter. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. On Passover, we eat unleavened bread. Yeast is a corrosive element. The kingdom of heaven is like a woman who took yeast and mixed it. That's a bad translation. The word in Greek is not mixed, it's encrypted. This is a stealth operation. This is a saboteur at work in the kitchen, out of sight. She takes corruption and she encrypts it into all of the flour until it's changed. And what Jesus is telling us is that sometimes the life of kingdom people means corrupting the corruption of the culture until it is all transformed. When the good people of the Mother Emanuel Church, the relatives of those who were shot in that terrible Bible study incident, when they stood there and in incredible bravery pronounced forgiveness on the killer, in a culture of revenge, they were corrupting the corruption of the culture. You know, I grew up, like most Southerners, in a segregated church. It has been said that that hour on Sunday is the most segregated time in our society. And in the early days of the civil rights movement, the civil rights workers in Atlanta were trying a disruptive technique. They were showing up for worship at all-white churches. I can't imagine today a milder form of disruption, but it was a form of disruption for the life of the segregated church. It happened to a church or two in Atlanta, and when it happened to those churches, every church, white church in Atlanta, had a conversation. What will we do if they come here? The session of our church in Doraville had such a conversation. Now, we were out in the country. They would never have been able to find our church. But if they came, and so important a decision it was, the clerk of session in worship one Sunday morning stood up and announced what the session had decided. And what he said was, if civil rights workers come for worship at our church, they will be admitted as long as there is room. We looked around, there were 75 empty pews, like there always were. And he began to spell out the policy, and several times he used the phrase, as long as there is room, and it became clear there wasn't going to be room, that it was a dodge. The fourth time he said it, Flora Miller. You remember Flora, about 5'1". She always wore a little pillbox hat with a mesh veil on Sunday. You remember Flora. She taught third grade Sunday school. You remember Flora. She stood up. Mr. Clerk, if there isn't room, they can have my pew. The imagination of disruption, that the gospel does not leave bigotry and anger and prejudice in place, but it is constantly undermining it with the extravagance and the reversal of God. I have no idea what the church is going to look like in 50 years. But I do know that it will look, if it is faithful, like the mind of Christ. And if it looks like the mind of Christ, it will be extravagant in its mercy. It will value and lift up those things that the world counts as small and insignificant. And by doing so, it will disrupt the powers and principalities around it, because it is the Church of Jesus Christ. I want to close by telling you this prayer that appears in some of the prayer books. Listen to it. Lord God, you have called your servants to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, by paths as yet untrodden, through perils unknown. Give us the faith to go out with good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us and your love supporting us, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you for listening.